October 5th, 1997, 6:40 a.m. Charlotte, North Carolina. David Scott Ghantt is arriving for what should be another routine Sunday morning shift at the Loomis Fargo armored car facility. He walks through the loading dock, past the reinforced trucks and steel security doors that protect millions of dollars in cash bound for banks across the Southeast. Everything appears normal. Same armed guards, same electronic surveillance, same impenetrable vault system that handles over $2 billion annually. What nobody knew was that in 8 hours, Ghantt would walk out of that facility with $17.3 million in cash. The largest armored car robbery in American history. No guns blazing, no hostages taken, no elaborate tunnels or high-tech gadgets, just a lonely security guard, a workplace crush, and the stupidest criminal plan ever to somehow succeed beyond anyone's wildest imagination. This is the story of how a group of amateur criminals stumbled into the heist of the century through pure dumb luck, then systematically destroyed their own success through greed, paranoia, and breathtaking incompetence. How a $17 million fortune was blown on Manchin's breast implants and a Velvet Elvis painting, and how the FBI's investigation became less of a manhunt and more of a comedy of errors, featuring criminals so inept they practically solved the case themselves. But first, you need to understand the man who made it all possible, and why David Ghantt is both the perfect inside man and the worst criminal mastermind in American history. David Scott Ghantt wasn't born to be a bank robber. The 27-year-old from Gustonia, North Carolina, was a quiet, unremarkable man who lived in a trailer with his wife and dreamed of adventures that would never come. He worked as a vault supervisor for Loomis Fargo, earning $8.15 an hour to move millions of dollars that would never be his. He was dependable, trustworthy, and completely invisible. Exactly the kind of employee who handles other people's money for decades without anyone paying attention. But Ghantt had two weaknesses that would prove catastrophic. He was desperately unhappy with his mundane life, and he was completely infatuated with a former co-worker named Kelly Campbell. Campbell had worked briefly at Loomis Fargo before quitting in 1996, but she had made a lasting impression on Ghantt during her short tenure. She was everything he thought he wanted. Attractive, exciting, and interested in him in ways his wife wasn't. When Campbell left Loomis, she stayed in touch with Ghantt, feeding his fantasies about escaping his boring life for something more adventurous. What Ghantt didn't know was that Kelly Campbell had problems of her own. She was drowning in debt, involved with dangerous people, and desperately looking for a way to score big money fast. When she learned about Ghantt's access to millions of dollars at Loomis Fargo, she began cultivating their relationship with a very specific goal in mind. Campbell's real connections were to a group of small-time criminals led by Steve Chambers, a 33-year-old wannabe crime boss who had spent years planning elaborate schemes that never quite worked out. Chambers had big dreams and bigger debts, and when Campbell told him about her inside contact at Loomis Fargo, he saw the opportunity he'd been waiting for his entire criminal career. The plan Chambers developed was remarkable in its simplicity and stunning in its lack of sophistication. Ghantt would simply load as much money as possible into the back of an armored truck during his shift, drive it to a predetermined location, and walk away. No elaborate security bypasses, no sophisticated timing, no careful planning for what would happen afterward. Just take the money and run. It was the kind of plan that should have failed within minutes of execution. But sometimes the stupidest plans work, precisely because they're too stupid for anyone to anticipate. The recruitment process was equally amateur. Campbell convinced Ghantt that this was their chance to escape together to a tropical paradise, where they could live happily ever after on stolen money. Chambers recruited his wife Michelle, his cousin Nathan Ghantt, and several other associates who were attracted by the promise of easy money, but had no real understanding of what they were getting into. None of them had experience with major crimes. None of them understood money laundering, evidence disposal, or long-term planning. Most incredibly, none of them seemed to realize that stealing $17 million would result in one of the largest criminal investigations in FBI history. They treated it like winning the lottery rather than committing a federal crime that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The planning phase, if it can be called that, took place over several months in 1997. But rather than studying security procedures or escape routes, The conspirators spent most of their time fantasizing about how they would spend the money. Chambers talked about buying mansions and luxury cars. Campbell dreamed of tropical vacations and expensive jewelry. Ghantt imagined finally living the exciting life he'd always wanted. What they didn't plan for was what would happen after the robbery. How would they divide the money? How would they avoid detection? How would they launder millions of dollars in cash without attracting attention? These questions were either ignored or answered with dangerous naivety that would prove to be their undoing. October 4th, 1997. Saturday evening, as Ghantt prepared for his final shift at Loomis Fargo, he was consumed by excitement and terror in equal measure. He had never committed a serious crime in his life, and the magnitude of what he was about to attempt was finally sinking in. But his infatuation with Campbell and his desperation to escape his mundane life overrode his common sense. The Loomis Fargo facility operated with minimal staff on weekends, making it the perfect time for an inside job. Ghantt would be working alone for several hours, with only periodic check-ins from supervisors. More importantly, the vault would be fully stocked with cash that had been delivered throughout the week, but not yet distributed to banks. Sunday, October 5th, 1997. The robbery itself was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Working alone in the vault, Ghantt systematically loaded $17.3 million in cash into a company van. He took mostly small bills that would be harder to track, filling duffel bags and cardboard boxers with more money than most people see in a lifetime. The physical act of stealing the money took less than 2 hours, but loading $17.3 million in cash is more complicated than it sounds. The money weighed over 2,800 pounds, requiring multiple trips and careful organization to fit everything into the vehicle. Ghantt worked methodically, driven by adrenaline and the fantasy of his new life with Kelly Campbell. At 6:30 p.m., Ghantt drove the loaded van out of the Loomis Fargo facility for the last time. He proceeded to a wooded area outside Charlotte, where Chambers and the other conspirators were waiting. The handoff went smoothly. Too smoothly, as it turned out. Within hours, Ghantt was on his way to Mexico with a small portion of the money, while the bulk of the $17.3 million remained with Chambers and his associates. But this was where the plan was completely fell apart. The first mistake was trusting Steve Chambers with the majority of the money. Rather than laying low and planning careful distribution of the funds, Chambers immediately began spending with reckless abandon. Within days of the robbery, he had purchased a new truck, expensive jewelry, and a $635,000 mansion in an exclusive neighborhood, all paid for in cash. The spending spree was so conspicuous that neighbors began asking questions. How does an unemployed man suddenly afford a mansion and luxury cars? Chambers' explanation, that he had inherited the money from a recently deceased relative, might have worked if he had simultaneously been throwing lavish parties and flashing wads of cash around town. Meanwhile, Kelly Campbell was engaging in equally stupid behavior. She underwent expensive cosmetic surgery, bought designer clothes and jewelry, and began living a lifestyle that was completely inconsistent with her legitimate income. Most incredibly, she maintained contact with Ghantt in Mexico, using phones and communication methods that the FBI would later trace with ease. Ghantt himself was proving equally inept at being a fugitive. Instead of disappearing completely, he was living openly in Mexican resort towns, using his real name in some transactions and making no effort to create a false identity. He was also growing increasingly paranoid about his former conspirators, correctly suspecting that they were keeping most of the money while leaving him exposed as the primary suspect. The FBI investigation began within hours of discovering the theft on Monday morning, October 6th. What agents found at the Loomis Fargo facility made it immediately clear that this was an inside job. The security systems hadn't been defeated. They had been bypassed by someone with legitimate access. More importantly, surveillance footage showed Ghantt's activities throughout his final shift. But even without that evidence, the FBI investigation would have succeeded because of the conspirators' spectacular lack of operational security. Within 2 weeks, agents had identified the entire network through financial records, surveillance footage, and witness statements from people who had observed the group's suddenly extravagant lifestyle. The break in the case came when investigators discovered Steve Chambers' mansion purchase. The transaction records showed a cash payment of $635,000 just days after the robbery, made by a man with no legitimate source of income. When agents began surveillance of the property, they observed behavior that confirmed their suspicions. Multiple people coming and going at odd hours, large amounts of cash being moved, and a general atmosphere of paranoia and guilty behavior. Michelle Chambers proved to be the weakest link in the conspiracy. When FBI agents approached her with evidence of the money laundering operation, she quickly agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony provided a detailed account of the entire operation, from the initial planning to the aftermath of the robbery. The arrests began in March 1998, nearly 5 months after the robbery. One by one, the conspirators were rounded up and charged with federal crimes carrying sentences of up to 25 years in prison. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Financial records, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and most damaging of all, their own incredible stupidity in handling the aftermath of the crime. David Ghantt was arrested in Mexico and extradited to face charges in Charlotte. During his interrogation, he provided a complete confession, apparently relieved to finally unburden himself of the stress and paranoia that had consumed him since the robbery. He also expressed bitter disappointment at being betrayed by Kelly Campbell and Steve Chambers, who had kept the majority of the money while leaving him to take the fall. The trial revealed the full extent of the conspirators' incompetence. Steve Chambers had spent over $600,000 on luxury items, including a BMW, expensive furniture. Most of the $17.3 million was eventually recovered by federal agents, though nearly $2 million was never accounted for and presumably spent on the conspirators' lifestyle upgrades. The recovered money was found in storage units, buried in backyards, and hidden in various locations around Charlotte, all documented in detail by the criminals themselves, who had apparently never heard of destroying evidence. David Ghantt was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Steve Chambers received 11 years. Kelly Campbell got 5 years. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from probation to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with authorities. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire case was how quickly the criminals turned on each other once they were caught. The loyalty and partnership that had supposedly motivated the robbery evaporated instantly when faced with serious prison time. Everyone blamed everyone else, provided detailed testimony against their former co-conspirators, and expressed shock that their foolproof plan had somehow gone wrong. Today, the Loomis Fargo robbery is studied in law enforcement academies as an example of how not to commit a major crime. The case demonstrates that while inside access can make theft possible, successful criminal enterprises require planning, discipline, and operational security that were completely absent from this group's approach. The robbery also revealed serious vulnerabilities in armored car operations that led to enhanced security procedures industry-wide. New protocols were implemented requiring multiple employees for vault access, improved surveillance systems, and better background checks for employees with access to large amounts of cash. But perhaps the most lasting lesson of the Loomis Fargo heist is that the largest robbery in American history was pulled off by people who had no idea what they were doing, and destroyed by the same incompetence that made it possible in the first place. Sometimes the biggest crimes are committed by the smallest criminals, and success without intelligence is just a temporary delay before inevitable failure. If you found the story as unbelievable as I did while researching it, make sure you subscribe, because next week, I'm investigating the Gardner Museum heist, where professional thieves walked away with $500 million in art and were never caught. These stories show the incredible range between criminal masterminds and complete amateurs. What amazed you most about this case? Their success despite total incompetence, or how quickly they destroyed themselves afterward? Let me know in the comments.